Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on taking genuine action against racism. So I am recording the webinar today as some people couldn't make it, and I think that particularly our panel later this afternoon will be really important for us to share far and wide. So it's a good opportunity to record and send this out to people. So if you have anybody that you'd like to share it with as well, just flick me an email and let me know if you want the link. So before I start today's webinar, I do just want to acknowledge that we're recording and presenting on Kaurna country. And also I'd like to acknowledge any other countries that you may be meeting on today, and also any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us in the webinar today. If you would like to, there is a chat function, and I'd be really excited to see if there are any of you meeting from different countries or different places. Yeah, so just pop in the chat where you're from and what country maybe you'd like to acknowledge. So today's webinar is going to be really a very short, sharp and shiny opportunity to talk about what racism is, how it is impacting our community at the moment. And then we're going to hear from Professor Naomi Priest, Julie Bova and Sean Childs on, I guess, their own understandings of how racism is currently impacting children and young people and how it's being dealt with in schools and early learning settings. So that they'll be coming online at 3:30. But in the meantime, I wanted to give you, I guess, a bit of an overview about how anti-racism fits with reconciliation work and how it connects to reconciliation action planning. And also just to give you, I guess, some very beginning information, some kind of foundational information ready for when that Q&A starts. The other thing that I will mention is that the chat box is there for you at any time to ask questions, to pose any thoughts or ideas. And if you do have some burning questions that you would like to ask our panel at 3:30, please put them in there now and I can make sure to ask those questions as well. So today what I'm going to go through with you is, I guess, our own definitions from Reconciliation South Australia of what racism is. And these are not in any way the only definitions. There's lots of different language out there used to describe racism and racial behaviour and racial discrimination. But we'll go through, I guess, the terminology that we use and what we find is helpful to use with children and young people. We'll also go through how this relates to reconciliation and the 5 dimensions of reconciliation. And then most importantly, understanding how you can take action as an educator or as a person, a member of our society, what sorts of things you can do to be anti-racist, and hopefully point you towards some resources that will support you with that. So up on the screen now, I've just got, I guess, the 3 definitions that we use when we're talking about racism and when we're defining racism and how it kind of manifests in the community. So the first one up there is obvious racism, then we have invisible, and then we have systemic. What's important to note with racism and racial discrimination is, I guess, they're 2 separate things. So racism is when people's behaviour is racist towards communities, and racial discrimination is when that racism is actually illegal. So when it is against discrimination acts or laws and systems that are in place. But often the kind of racism that we see in our community is not always that illegal racism, and it's kind of much more insidious and sneaky. So racism can happen, I guess, on 3 main levels. So we talk about it in an individual or interpersonal way, also an institutional way, and then a systemic way. So that's how, I guess, those 3 areas kind of then fit into these 3 definitions. So the first area to talk about is obvious racism. And obvious racism is really any of those incidents of racism that are big, that are really easy for you to identify, particularly for those of you who are joining us that are not an Aboriginal person or not a person of colour who maybe has not experienced racism before. Definitions of this kind of include using like slurs or other inappropriate language. It can be violence. It can also be graffiti. It can be things in Facebook comments. But I guess the most important reason why we call it obvious is because it's pretty easy for us to identify it. There's no kind of grey area. It's pretty easy to say that incident was racist and this is why. The kind of trickier stuff or the sneakier stuff is what we call invisible racism. And I actually have a video that I'll show you in a moment that illustrates this better, I think, than I can explain. But invisible racism are those kind of small is kind of not the right word, but those incidents of racism that happen that maybe we're as non-Aboriginal people or people who are not used to experience racism, they may go a bit over our heads or we may not see them. And yeah, I'll show you the video and give you some time maybe to reflect on that video after. And then the final definition of racism that we use is systemic. And I think when we're talking about racism and how it impacts communities, and when we're talking about how we can be anti-racist educators, this is by far the most important area to think about, because when we look at racism, systemic racism is often what is then filtering down and causing attitudes or beliefs or values that then impact people's, obvious or invisible acts of racism. So systemic is all those policies, procedures, laws. It can be social contracts as well, things that are putting up barriers towards particular racial groups. And there are a lot of examples of that in our history in Australia, dating back from colonisation to now, where there are systems that are failing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and as such are causing systemically racist things to occur. One of, I guess, the easiest examples of where systemic racism has had racist implications and continues to impact Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is the stolen generation and the policies that led to that process, such as the protector position being put into place, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being removed from their families, and the implications that have continued over time, which then also, I guess, link to values that people may hold around, whether Aboriginal people are able to care for their children. That comes from those systemically racist decisions and then impacts the values and beliefs that people hold in 2022. There's plenty of other examples, but given that we have 30 minutes to go through some of this foundational knowledge, I'm zipping through. So I'm going to play a video for you now, and then I'm just going to give you a minute or so to pause at the end. And if you do have anything that you'd like to say about the video, pop it in the chat. That's always a really great place to share our thoughts and ideas about this. And really the purpose of this video is to, engage you in feeling about this work and how it makes other people feel. And I think this video illustrates that really nicely.
You're not staying there, right? What do you think she's up to? Don't make eye contact.
What about my change? And the Abo barman says,
Go on. It's only a joke.
Discrimination leads to depression and anxiety in Indigenous Australians. No one should be made to feel like crap just for being who they are.
If you've got any kind of things that stood out for you in that video, I would really suggest popping them in the chat box, and sharing with each other about maybe which one of those like small vignettes really impacted you the most or kind of made you feel something. For me, I've watched that video many times now, and it changes kind of every time I watch that video. But today in particular, I caught the train to work. And so I think as such, that video that shows the man sitting on the bus and intentionally moving his briefcase to allow someone to sit with him, and just that kind of emotion that it shows on his face when he realizes that that woman doesn't want to sit next to him. And I guess understanding that, like, these incidents of racism can happen multiple times throughout a person's day. And so, while watching these videos, you might be seeing one thing that you think maybe is, not too bad, or it was just once, but actually when these things kind of pile up on top of each other, it can be really detrimental. And that video is created by Beyond Blue. And I think it's really important to talk about the fact that racism is not just around education, but is actually around public health and around the well-being of people who we're living in society with, and how we make sure that everybody feels included and welcome, and also is able to be their happiest, healthiest, and most secure self. But I mean, the other thing about that video I think that is important to consider is that there are things that we can do, and there's actually a lot that we can do to make our society better for everybody. But it starts with our own kind of self-reflection and thinking about who we are as educators and what we do and what we bring, not just to the classroom. While this is very much today is about education and about what it means to educate young children all the way to secondary school. Anti-racist behaviour doesn't stop when you leave the classroom. And this is really about thinking about who you are as a person and what your identity is and what your commitment is to this work. So that brings me to the next slide, which is what is anti-racism. So we talk about anti-racism and taking action against racism. And essentially, the quote that's up on the screen here really defines that better than I could. So Angela Davis is a really incredible activist from the United States, and it's worth investigating some of her work. But, this kind of statement, it's not enough to just not be racist, but we must be anti-racist, I think really encapsulates the fact that anti-racism is about action. And so, when we're thinking about anti-racism, we're thinking about that we're not just sitting here complacently letting racism happen around us and saying, but I'm not racist. We're actually doing things to ensure that we're constantly learning and we're constantly changing the way that we view the world and we view those around us. The other thing I think is really important to note, and what I'm hoping that you'll get from today's webinar, is that anti-racism is not just that speaking out against racism work. And so while some of those incidents of racism that we saw in the Invisible Discriminator video, it would be a helpful response for someone to intervene. But how you intervene is up to you, and how safe you feel and all of those things. But there's actually a whole bunch of work you can do as well that isn't as, well, that's maybe not true. It shouldn't be as confronting. It should be uncomfortable. But things you can do like reading, like watching documentaries, engaging with people who do experience racism and listening to their stories, and understanding the impacts that racism is having on our communities and doing something real and genuine about that. So there's a really great book which I'll recommend as a resource. You'll see that on my final slide, by someone called Ibram X. Kendi, and they wrote How to Be Anti-Racist. It's a really amazing book, a great kind of starting point when you're thinking about this work. And they talk about anti-racism as being, I guess, like a sticky name tag that you can put on and take off. And essentially their thoughts, particularly for those of us who are white and who are not experiencing racism, that when you take that anti-racist name tag off, you immediately fall into a place of racism. So when you're not actively being anti-racist, you're at least complicit in allowing racism to happen around you. And so this is where, you know, the anti-racist name tag, we want to keep that on as much as possible. And we can do that through our learning and our growth and how we have conversations with other people and talk through how racism is impacting those around us. So there was some research, and this I think comes from Naomi's research. I actually don't have the notes in front of me, but I'm sure she can talk to that in the panel a bit later. But there was actually some data that showed that almost 20% of students from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background reported experiences of racial discrimination from their own teachers and educators. And so I think it's really important, I guess, in talking about our identities as educators, as teachers, that particularly that invisible discrimination can happen, and we can be people who are, you know, whether intentional or not, being racist to the young people and the children who we are responsible for educating, for teaching. And that's where, I guess, this self-identity work and reflecting on who we are as teachers is really important, because often we bring with us a whole cohort of issues and challenges and biases and values that maybe impact the way in which we teach our students. And so it's really important to be self-aware and be constantly engaging in self-reflection, because there are things like unconscious bias that really impact the way that we engage with other people, and also, you know, our experiences. And so being mindful of that, and I guess being mindful of the fact that none of us are safe and that we all could be responsible for harm or hurting others when we're not actively thinking about this and actively working towards being better teachers and educators. And if you have any questions on that, again, pop them in the chat, because I am like kind of going through this very quickly, which means a lot of your reflection or your thinking about this will happen obviously after today's webinar. So feel free to email me as well. So a lot of people do ask me for an example about what this means. And this is one of the examples that we received from a school where in one example, a school didn't allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students to walk around in groups of more than 3. And I think a lot of people are really horrified by that example. And I think that that's an adequate response. But also, I think that you need to be mindful of the fact that this is happening in a school, which means that you've got lots and lots of teachers working within a school that are all allowing this rule that has been created by the principal, by leadership, could have happened 10 years ago and just hasn't been reviewed. They're letting this rule continue to be implemented. So they're sitting back, and whether they're actively, you know, enforcing this rule is irrelevant, because they're complicit in letting other people enforce this rule and letting a rule exist that is specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and disadvantages them both in their social context and also, you know, engaging with their own peers. So I think it's important to note that, and also to note that even if you are not the person that's complicit and working at this school, that you are, you know, sharing this profession, and you may be at conferences with people who allow this to happen. And so, you know, I don't want to get too, it's important to never get too caught up in it's not me or I'm not doing things, because we're responsible for our community and we need to work together to ensure that this doesn't happen, which means having those difficult, challenging conversations with our colleagues and really, you know, challenging perspectives, challenging ideas, and being uncomfortable in those conversations, because sometimes that discomfort can really change things around you. So then in terms of how this all links to reconciliation work, it's pretty simple. We have what's called the 5 dimensions of reconciliation, and they are the framework that really underpins the work that we do at Reconciliation South Australia and that we try and engage our community in. And one of the I guess it's important to say that all of these dimensions are interrelated and interconnected. And in order to achieve a just and reconciled Australia, we need to have them all happening and working together. And they do overlap with each other. But the anti-racism work that I'm talking about really sits nicely in the dimension race relations, where we're working towards a society that is free of racism. But in order to work towards a society that is free of racism, those other dimensions that you see up on the screen are also really important for, I guess, changing that. So, you know, we can take anti-racist action and we can do things like learn about ourselves and speak out against racism when we see it. But, you know, in order to really achieve a society that's free of racism, we also need to look at our institutions, and we require them to have integrity, to be thinking about how, you know, we employ more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into positions of leadership, of power. How we, you know, ensure that our policies, our procedures, our laws, our kind of constitution is reflective of the fact that we have a population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people not only living in Australia, but were the first custodians of our country and were here, you know, 60,000 plus years ago. So there's things as well like historical acceptance in order to really move towards you know, a society that's free of racism. We also need to accept those wrongs of our past and how they have impacted us and brought us to where we are today. So you can see that those 5 dimensions do really connect with each other. And, you know, you can't really have one without the others, kind of, they all work together. So one of the ways, I guess, in which you can really support anti-racism work within an education community specifically is through the Narragansett website and through using that kind of Narragansett reconciliation in education community. This work is really community based, and so you can utilize this tool to think about how you can connect with others. You can actually use the site itself to look at who already has a RAP and look at some of the things that they might be doing or connect with them. And I think that that is really powerful when it comes to anti-racism work as well, because there is real power in community and coming together and sharing our resources and sharing our knowledge, because we can't be the experts or the knowledge holders of everything. And so we need to work with each other in order to really combat racism and work towards that society that's free of racism. But one of the best things that you can use the Narragansett platform for is to develop a reconciliation action plan. And if you haven't got one in your site already, or you may be doing it already, but you've got some actions that you're not feeling as confident in, it's really every school that I visit does kind of let me know that the take action against racism action in a RAP is probably the one they're the least confident in or feeling the most kind of worried or nervous about. And so this is where you can really use that reconciliation action plan format to commit to really strong actions and you know, create deliverables underneath that take action against racism to, you know, ensure that you're doing some really practical and tangible things within your school or early learning site as well. I'm going to skip that one actually. So within a reconciliation action plan, there are 14 actions that are required. I think there are 40 now in total that you can choose from. But those 14 required, I kind of look at them as the minimum standard. They're the 14 things that any school or early learning service should be doing to, you know, work towards a just and reconciled Australia. And one of the big ones is that take action against racism. So there's On the Narragansett site, there are a bunch of resources underneath this action that you can access and can support you and resource you to do this work effectively. But you really need to commit and think about how you're writing deliverables or how you're planning appropriately for taking action against racism. So just up on the screen here, I've got just a few examples of goals or things that you can start to think about and unpack a little bit more as someone working with children and young people. So the first kind of things to do in this space are learning about what racism is and teaching about racism. And when we say teaching about racism, I don't mean that you pull your kindergarten cohort together and talk to them specifically about racism, but it's about, you know, things like unlearning stereotypes and ensuring that there's visibility and representation within the books and movies and other things that you show children and young people. It's about, you know, setting up inclusive environments and making sure that you're inviting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into your classroom or into your early learning setting, so that, you know, students are, you know, engaging in relationships with people and unlearning some of those kind of really terrible stereotypes that particularly our media platforms tend to show us. So it's, you know, I guess making those ongoing commitments to having racism as something that you're working towards undoing within your setting, however that may look. And, you know, reviewing resources, reviewing your curriculum and thinking about how you can make it more inclusive and more anti-racist. Which leads me to being an anti-racist educator. And that's really about making a commitment yourself that you are constantly critically reflecting about who you are. You learn about your identity. And by learning about your identity, you learn about things like privilege. You learn about things like how you are bringing unconscious bias into the classroom, into your preschool, how you're maybe, you know, your experiences or your values are not always the most appropriate thing to be in the classroom, or how they could be potentially holding up racism rather than kind of dismantling those systems. And then the final one, which I think is like possibly one of the most important things that you can take away from today, is having an anti-racism strategy. And that is really thinking about your systems, your institution, and how you're going to undo some of those maybe racist policies, procedures, things that kind of are in place that are not supportive of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families within your school or within your early learning setting. So an anti-racism strategy can be a big kind of overarching statement about what you want to achieve, but it can also be about reviewing the documents that already exist within your site. And making sure that everybody is on board and everybody that you work with understands what anti-racism is and what you're trying to achieve. And again, these are like very quick, snappy ideas, and so you'll have to go and do your own research after this. So this is just what the Take Action Against Racism action looks like on the Narragansett platform. And so you can see the tabs up the top there around, there's an overview, there's a need to know section. There are ideas for action that you can go into and really take back to your school or early learning settings. And then there are also professional learning resources and curriculum resources. So those curriculum resources are there to help you to be able to teach and bring different ideas into your classroom settings or your early learning settings. And the professional learning is there to accompany that, to make sure that you have the knowledge as a teacher and educator to be able to implement that curriculum resource. They often are very connected to each other. So if you're reading one of those curriculum resources and you're feeling a little bit unsure about what to do with it, there should be a professional learning resource that will help you to build your confidence and your capacity to then teach to that curriculum resource. But you can see on the screen, there's a bunch of stuff that you can do and achieve. The other thing I should mention that you can't see on the screen because my screenshot doesn't show it, but there's also, for those 14 required actions, there is a video that goes with each one. And those videos can help you again to see what early learning settings and schools, primary and secondary, are actually doing to, I guess, engage in anti-racism action, and how they're taking those genuine actions towards, you know, getting racism out of their schools and out of their early learning settings. So it's 3:30, so I'm going to take a pause, and if you want to quickly, you know, stand up, you know, go for a quick walk, get yourself a drink of water or a cup of tea, I'll get us sorted for our panel and then you can come back. So thank you. We'll be just a couple of minutes. Awesome. I'll get my panelists. Are you able to put your videos on for me, or do you need me to do that? Oh, there's Naomi. Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey.
Sean's just around the corner from me. I can probably hear him.
I can hear you.
Okay, well, I'll get into the second half now, and we can just go straight into the Q&A. But before I start, you know, putting you on the spot and asking you some questions, I will introduce our panelists. So first we have Professor Naomi Priest, and she is a group leader of social biological research at the Centre for Social Research and Methods, Australian National University, which is co-located at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. I've got a really big bio, and she told me that I didn't have to read it all, but I didn't put her additions onto my notes here. But I will say, you know, her research program is focused on examining, I guess, the social forces and social exposures, how there are social determinants of health and health inequalities in mental health and cardiovascular disease for Aboriginal and ethnic minoritized children and adolescents. And Naomi's been pivotal in the Speak Out Against Racism program, which, you know, has really, a lot of the research around that has been kind of important for Reconciliation SA's work in anti-racism. We often quote and direct people to that research as well. So thank you, Naomi, for joining us. And I'm losing my voice. I haven't done a webinar for a long time, so I'm getting a bit croaky. Then we have Julie, and Julie is someone who Reconciliation SA has worked really closely with now for a number of years. Julie is a teacher with over 14 years experience in early childhood, family daycare and primary school settings. She joined the Narragansett team after time in roles as an educator, a business owner, a classroom teacher and a school leader. Julie believes that education is the primary tool for advancing reconciliation in Australia, and she lives and works in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. And then finally, we have Sean Childs, who is my colleague at Reconciliation SA and works as our anti-racism program officer, working in schools on a couple of our anti-racism programs, so Generation of Change and Like Me, Like You, as well as responding to racism in the workplace, so working with adults and thinking about how racism also impacts, you know, workplaces like state government and corporations. So Sean Childs is a proud Kokatha and Wirangu man whose family resides from the far west coast of South Australia. He works as our anti-racism project officer and facilitates program management of anti-racism programs in high schools and workplaces. His previous roles and background include Cultural Programs Coordinator at the Department for Infrastructure and Transport, which included being an Aboriginal mentor, cultural advisor and RAP committee member. So thank you all so much for joining us for this panel. And allowing me some time off of talking. So I guess
Do we get to see Sean and Julie?
No, we can't see each other.
Oh, I don't know why. I
Oh,
can see all of you on my screen.
I mean, yeah, no, you look beautiful, but I can't see Sean and Julie.
Hang on, I'm gonna remove my pin, and hopefully that might help a little bit. But if not, I have no idea how to solve that IT.
That's all right.
Sorry.
I'm like, I don't need to see
It's the
myself.
same on my end. Yeah, it's the same on my end. I can't see Naomi or Julie.
Oh, well, I'll take a screenshot and I'll send that.
I'm sick of seeing your face in that. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't need to see my face. I want to see someone else's.
Well, hopefully on the recording, it's not just my face, but I guess we'll see. But at least we can hear you. And yeah, I need an IT person, but unfortunately,
It's all good.
we don't have that. So I guess the first question that I want to start us off with is maybe, and whoever wants to answer this question first is what is racism? So how do you define it, or what is it? We're going to be shy. Should I just throw to someone? I'm going to throw to you, Naomi, put you on
I
the
knew you were
spot
going to do
first.
that. Yeah, so hi everyone. I mean, I want to start off by saying, I always try and say this when I speak, is that racism is not my lived experience. I'm a white settler on unceded land, grew up in South Australia on Ngarrindjeri and Kaurna land. So lots of links to where lots of you are from. So yeah, I want to state that really clearly. But in our work, when we're thinking about racism, we talk about it primarily as an ideology, actually, as a whole belief system. Often when we're talking about what is and isn't racism, and I did listen to your talk earlier, great job. We do get really stuck at that sort of individual level, whether someone's called something a hurtful name, or there's been an assault or excluded someone. But we have to think about that in that wider context of ideology of inferiority and of ranking different social groups, different parts of people in society, groups of people in a hierarchy, and considering some better than others, with white people at the top. And even racism actually creates race. Race is not a biological or a scientific concept. If we look at the Human Genome Project, if we look at genetic variation, it doesn't actually map on to racial groups. There's far more difference between within groups than there are between groups. So yeah, racism really creates that ideology, creates that hierarchy of some considered better than others, and then allocates opportunities, resources to those considered advantaged, usually white people, and then disempowers and oppresses those who are at the bottom of that hierarchy. So it's important to think about it in that context. And then we often think about racism in three levels. So that's really structural, societal, institutional level, the way systems and policies and practices privilege some people in society, and then oppress others, or advantage and disadvantage. I often talk about those two sides. We have to talk about them both together. It's not just disadvantage, it's who gets advantaged as well. And then at that interpersonal level, which we're much more familiar talking about, which is that between individuals. And then the one that doesn't get talked about very much is that internalized racism, where those who are considered by society to be inferior take on those beliefs about themselves. So an Aboriginal student who then believes, because I'm Aboriginal, I'm not going to be good at maths, or I'm not going to amount to anything. That's obviously not come from them or their own culture. It's come from wider society's messaging. So yeah, that's how we think about racism in our work.
Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, that's a great overview, and yeah, I've already learned something. So Julie or Sean, do you have anything to add around like your own understandings of racism? Oh, Julie can't unmute. Sean, while I try and help.
So yeah, look, yeah, Naomi summed that up very well, and yourself, Nat. Very articulate way of describing, what is racism. But yeah, I agree. It's hierarchies. It's people in position of power and privilege that have that privilege, and sometimes they don't even realize that they have it. So as an Aboriginal person here, that it was always something that it was kind of them and us growing up, because it was always something that was always had a label, or something that was always attached to being an Aboriginal person, and the stereotypes and the commentary around that, and the language used. And when you're younger, you don't really necessarily realize that that it's harmful. You kind of go, okay, that's kind of the way it is, or the language used. So I think it's more so when you get older, you start to realize and mature and say, okay, no, that's not acceptable. This type of stuff is racist, and what does it sound like? What does it look like? Can really have an impact, and it has impacts on people, as you mentioned, not just with the bus stop scenario with the Beyond Blue, but there's numerous occasions daily that those impacts happen, and it can have a really psychological effect with people, and then that can then spiral to other things. So yeah, it's very important that we all know what racism is, and I'm sure we'll discuss that when we get into the other questions. So
thanks, Sean. And that's kind of a good, I guess, segue into the next question, and I might throw this one to Julie. But how are you seeing racism impacting our communities and socially, I guess, at the moment?
Thanks, Nat. I guess I just want to reiterate Naomi's point about I'm in a similar situation, and my position is similar in that I'm a white colonizer living on unceded land. So it's kind of hard for me to put myself in the position of someone who's experienced racism, because I won't have to do that in my life. So, but I can talk as a teacher who works in this space and talks to a lot of teachers and educators about racism. And so your question was, what is the impact on communities? I guess, firstly, the impact on students is significant, and that those things that Sean talked about, as well as the impact that then has on those students' families. I think racism impacts teachers and educators and their capacity, or our capacity, I'm also a teacher, to do our work in really hidden ways sometimes, because it really takes a lot of self-reflection and understanding of positionality for teachers and educators to be able to address racism in ways that are effective. And so I guess the racism is impacting on learners in that way, because teachers are not necessarily always equipped to see when they themselves are perhaps unintentionally being racist, or supporting racist policies, or school-wide policies and practices. But most importantly is that we need to address this and really work towards anti-racism, so that those students and families don't have to experience racism.
Thanks, Julie. And I think it's really great to get that kind of teacher perspective, because I very much agree and echo your and Naomi's sentiment about that we don't experience racism. So we're talking about it from a very different perspective, but also, we're working in a teaching workforce where we've got the majority of current working teachers are from white European background. And so we need to be making sure that people like us are aware of this and are having these kind of conversations and being really open about our identities and what it is that we bring to this work. So, because we need to be, I guess, undoing that damage that colonisation has done. So, Naomi, do you have anything to add to that around, I guess, the impacts you've seen through your research on society, on communities? I've done something bad to the mutes.
No, it's what it is that we can't, once we mute ourselves again, then we
We
need to
can't
unmute.
I'm going to work out how to fix that problem while you're answering that.
Yeah, we're just getting a
Naomi.
thunderstorm coming through here. So I was unmuting myself. Oh, I mean, I can talk about the health and well-being effects of racism for a really long time, because that's a lot of what I study, really. And I know that you talked about this in the previous session too. And certainly some of the framing that I'm an epidemiologist, so really interested in health and what makes people well and healthy and societies well and healthy. And so we study racism and health, not to prove that racism is bad. Racism is unfair and unjust and a breach of human rights. Just it is. That's the case. But it also contributes to really poor health and well-being and to poor educational outcomes, social outcomes, and so on. And Sean highlighted earlier, and I can see someone's put in the chat too about subtle comments and overt comments they're really wearing. They have that really cumulative psychological impact. There's heaps of studies showing how it impacts on depression, anxiety, suicide risk, behaviour problems, so many mental health and wellbeing outcomes for children at a really early age, even in preschool years. But there's also a growing body of work from colleagues overseas, and we've started to do this work here showing how experiences of racism at an individual level, as well as, of course, at a structural societal level, have physiological impacts and actually get under the skin to cause chronic inflammation, dysregulated nervous systems, even cellular aging. So can have really, really profound effects. So it's obviously a safety issue. Everyone has a right to feel safe, to not be discriminated against, but also, it can cause huge health harms as well.
Thank you, Naomi. And I've fixed the mute issue now, so you'll be able to mute on and off without me being completely in control of it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And anyone I know we don't have long today, but I'll put my email in the chat and, happy to follow up afterwards as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's a really important thing to note is that I think a lot of people see this purely, I guess, as like a social, emotional kind of issue, when it actually is having these and also, I guess, mental health, but it's actually having, and now there's evidence to show that it's having those physical impacts and health impacts, which I think is a key issue for, having a healthy society moving forward. So, Sean, I just would love to get your take on that as well, particularly, as an Aboriginal person, like what you see the impact within the communities that you work and engage in.
Yeah, obviously, the impacts are very serious, and I think Naomi and Julie mentioned around, the wellbeing and health impacts. But I can just provide an example around how, when I've got two nieces, they're 8 and 9, and I have a little nephew who's 2. My nieces are darker complexion than what I am, and when my eldest niece was in reception or year 1, it was probably around the first month, she come home to my mum, her Nana, and said, Nana, I don't want to be this colour. Why am I this colour? I'm not like everybody else. And she felt that because of the colour of her skin, she wasn't able to fit in. So that's a 5-year-old, 5-6-year-old saying this. So, when people say, oh yeah, kids that age don't understand, well, they actually do understand. And what about the kids that are having this behavior and this language used towards another person that has a darker skin than the rest of their school class? So and it's just that that confirmation, and that I suppose us as a family getting behind her and saying, no, Michaela, be proud of who you are, just you are who you are, and be proud of that. But it's it was really heartbreaking to be able to hear that from a 5-year-old coming home and not liking the color of her skin because of her friends not having that skin color. So the impacts there from that age, they really kind of get categorized as such into those types of things. So community level, again, when you get older and when you it's happening everywhere. And yeah, when we talk about health impacts, when I was younger, for example, a lot of my uncles and aunties and cousins and stuff were passing away, in the early 50s, mid 50s. And I thought as a kid that was really old, dying, at 52 years old from heart problems and things like that. But it's not, we already have a 10-year life expectancy less than non-Aboriginal people. So those things have to be, a lot of people have to be aware of that. And, what we do can really help with trying to have that, better life in the future. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for sharing that, because I know that is personal, and I appreciate that you shared that with the group. So I guess we've got some information about how it's impacting people, and that it has health implications. But what can we kind of do to support teachers and educators to be able to, I guess, build their confidence, to be anti-racist within their education settings? What sort of practical advice would you give teachers and educators? And I might throw you to Julie first, because I know she knows the Narragansett Wally platform back to front, and will be able to share some insight on that.
Yeah, thanks, Nat. I guess the Narragansett Wally platform, there are multiple ways that it can be used to support professional learning and whole-scale kind of approach to anti-racism within a school or a service. One thing I did want to point out just before I jump into talking about that is that in the most recent Australian Reconciliation Barometer, there is a question asked about trust for professionals in the community, so community helpers like teachers, principals, police, doctors, nurses, medical staff, and things like that. And I just wanted to point out just again how important this work is, because Indigenous respondents reported levels of very high trust for teachers and school principals at a lower rate. So they thought teachers and principals were less trustworthy than police, doctors, and medical staff. So that's pretty alarming, considering the state of reconciliation in Australia in general. So I guess a couple of things to use, ways that you can use the Narragansett Wally platform to do this work. So one is through the Take Action Against Racism action. So if you have a reconciliation action plan and you commit to this action, you can use all of the information on that action to work towards anti-racist strategies in your school or service. So this is one of the required actions. And what it has on there is kind of ideas for action. So things that you can actually engage with that will make a difference in your school or service. So I'll just list a couple of them. So there are things like reflecting on your own personal and cultural identity. So this is around kind of self-reflection and positionality, understanding your positionality as a person within Australian society, also as a professional, and then also as a professional within your institution, so your school, and within the system. And we need to look at it from all of those perspectives to really make a difference. So you can do things like reflecting on your personal cultural identities, prioritising diverse voices within your school, so including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices in your curriculum planning and the resources that you're using, building relationships with the community to bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices into your learning spaces. You can increase your own awareness of diversity and racism. And if you go onto the platform, there are many, many links to external kind of resources to support you to do this work. There are also jurisdictional anti-racism policies and strategies. So if you work for the South Australian Department for Education, for example, you can have a look on the website and access the anti-racism policies and strategies and see what you can take from those. And there are many, many anti-racism initiatives and campaigns that you can join as well. But that's just an example of how you can use the ideas for action in the Take Action Against Racism RAP action. Another really important thing to do is to engage in professional learning. So many teachers and educators, and I'm one of them, and I'm sure there are many in the room today, didn't have many opportunities to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives when we were going through our primary, secondary and tertiary education systems. And so even though it might feel like we should be really well prepared to enter into classrooms, in fact, in Australia, because of racism itself, we're almost always not prepared. And so it takes kind of professional learning after our degrees, after our teaching degrees, to get us to a place where we can engage in this anti-racism work in a really effective way. And I'm going to stop and pass it on.
Thanks, Julie. And I think it's important for people to know as well that the Narragansett team are always available to support you in understanding what is out there on that website and within the education RAPs. And I can also support with that as well. So, you know, you can always get in contact with Julie or that team too. Naomi, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well about, I guess, what you think from some of the research that you've done in how teachers and educators can be supporting anti-racism with children and with young people.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and certainly would echo everything that Julie said, you know, starting with reflecting on our own positionality, obviously engaging in professional learning, and both engaging with, you know, what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations have written and are talking about, but also reading up on, you know, what is racism. And I'm going to put one thing in the chat there. That's a resource that we developed for Vic Health last year that covers a bit of what I'm talking about today. And yeah, absolutely agree, Chris. It has to come from leadership. And I'd say even beyond school leaders at a departmental level too, that, you know, schools, and there's a number of sort of charters and agreements that schools need to be safe for all students, and that includes being free from racism. So, you know, we can think about it as individual teachers or educators. I teach as well, of course, as an academic. But also, how are our systems? You know, is there a reporting mechanism in place for if there's racism in the school? Has there been an audit done of the school library and the curriculum materials? You know, do we engage with our local Aboriginal Education Advisory Group or elders, or, you know, really thinking about it as a whole? And I think Chris has said a really good point there too. I think you should be on the panel here, Chris. You're participating. It's great. It is really hard for individual teachers to do this work without the support. And, you know, teachers have it's great. I love it. No apologies needed. You know, psychological safety and well-being for teachers, you know, teachers have an enormous load to carry. Both my parents are teachers, my brother-in-law is a teacher. I know how hard teachers work. It's hard going out there. And so making sure that teachers as individuals are safe and supported in that context, especially if you're an Aboriginal teacher or a teacher of colour. Yeah, so you need a coalition of the willing too, right, to be able to do that work together. So, you know, achievable goals and emotional safety within that is really important. One program that I have been involved with is that Speak Out Against Racism project, which was for primary schools, and we're now looking at expanding that out more broadly, but that involved a whole number of different activities. So it was professional learning for teachers, an audit of school curriculum and school policies and practices and guidelines, some units of work for the students to do, some student-led anti-racist work as well. So, you know, really thinking about it as this, you know, wicked problems need wicked solutions, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Naomi. Yeah, and I think I'm sure that Sean will reiterate this as well, but we have spoken a lot within Reconciliation SA about the need for better reporting structures on incidents of racism that are happening within schools, because they're currently recorded as bullying or not at all. And, you know, it's really hard without data. Like any work, it's always easier to kind of convince people of things when you've got data to support you. So we're right on 4 o'clock. So Sean, I'll just finish up with you around, I guess, your work, knowing that you go into schools a lot. What sorts of things do you think could help teachers and educators in building that confidence?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I realise we've come to the end, but absolutely, I echo everything that was just mentioned, and thank you again, Chris, for kind of bringing this to light. But my experiences going into high schools, and you know, I've done a lot in the past year and a bit with high schools and about the reporting systems, and I've only had this conversation with Nat only recently about that there's no reporting system when it comes to racism in schools. If there is, it's to do with bullying. It's a violent act. There's a fight on an oval, not even knowing what the fight was, even how it got started, but it's just put into a file with bullying, and then it just gets left there. So we would very much like to have a recording system, some data that, you know, has racial incidences that occur on the schoolyard, because for example, my partner is a school teacher, so she tells me firsthand that at her school that there's a lot of racial incidences that happen, and there's kind of vigilante systems going on with, because someone calls someone a name, so then that group will go over and then violently assault another kid, and then it gets put into a file system that's, you know, to do with bullying. So there needs to be more work and more awareness around that. But I absolutely agree that it has to do with leadership and you know, head of school, etc., that really implement these strategies. The conversations I've had with teachers in some schools is what was mentioned before around might be 1 or 2 teachers that are really trying to drive this change, but there's no buy-in to any of the school or any of the leadership there. So, and they're finding it really hard to really try to get this message across about how do we combat racism. And especially when we go in to do these sessions of Generation of Change, we don't want it to just stop on the day. We want it to really create conversations, get everybody uncomfortable in regards to talking about racism, but have a lot of the staff, the teachers there really being an ally with us as well. So when we go, the teachers are actually carrying this on, carrying the message on about racism and how we can all be better allies with trying to combat it. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do in that space, but definitely the leadership has to be coming from there, but also recording systems so we can really get into those pockets to addressing racism. So but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Sean. I just also wanted to read out a comment, because I think it is like really, really important to reiterate for anyone watching this recording later. A reporting system requires Aboriginal input, as assessment of racism cannot be made by non-Aboriginal people only. And Jennifer, that is really important, and I 100% agree with you. And I think that, you know, that's why this anti-racism work, it's not just race relations, but it requires looking at systems and who's working in workplaces, and, you know, getting more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers teaching in the workforce. And, you know, like there's just so much that we can do. So I think I'm hoping that from today, people really go away realizing that it isn't just speaking out against racism if you see it on a bus, but there's so many things that you can do individually and within your school to hopefully improve things for everybody. So look, I just really want to extend my thanks to Naomi, Julie and Sean for joining us today. And it was too short. We got through, I think, about 3 of the questions that I'd designed for today. But, you know, hopefully this is like a bit of a seed that we've planted, and people will go away and read some of those resources that you've shared in the chat, and, you know, start watering that seed a little bit. And yeah, any last thoughts before I close up?
Just a huge thank you, Nat, for inviting us. One last comment from me would be that about one of the questions that you're going to ask was around myths about racism in Australia. And I just wanted to point out the difference between multiculturalism and kind of sovereign nations of Australia. So there's another level. So for people to go away and read about that too might be an important thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. That's definitely some extra study that people can do after this. So hopefully you all are so excited that you'll go away from today and do heaps of reading and share everything that you're learning with people around you, because I can't stress the importance of community and community learning and conversations and dialogue with each other. It can be really powerful. So awesome. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Email me if you would like a recording. I will send through the resources from the chat to those that registered. Everyone who's attending will have my email address, but I'll put it in the chat as well. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thanks.
Bye.